Welcome everyone to Pontos Fathom Press. This is our Pontos Fathom podcast, episode number 55. And today we're going to be continuing our study into the astrological Uranian energy. So we'll be focusing on the planet Uranus in astrology and how it relates to artificial intelligence. We've been doing a number of these astrological, let's call it comparisons using the astrological theory, let's say the philosophy of astrology, more than a predictive astrology. And we've done it for the planet Saturn. We did a number of podcasts here on the deep dive of Saturn. I think our Saturn ones, we talked everything from the idea of the nature of the dragon. We looked at Saturn and the idea of time, karma, the cult of the black cube. We looked at Saturn in terms of the Lord of the Rings, the Black Iron Prison, Chronos, the fear of time. Then we moved on to Neptune. So in astrological Neptune, we talked a bit about Neptune and artificial intelligence. We did Neptune in pop culture like Avatar and Led Zeppelin. We talked about that. We also did esoteric names of Neptune, specifically around Steiner's calling out of the fact that Saturn is the traditional last planet in ancient astrology. So with the advent and discoveries of these newer planets, it seems that at least the certain mystery schools are reluctant to attribute all of the things that we are to these planets. Some saying to the point that it's projection, psychological projection in some ways. But we also did Neptune in artificial intelligence. And I think in our Neptune in the Steiner comment, I think what we really focus on is focusing on the works of someone like a Liz Green, who looks at psychology. I think armed with psychology and the mechanisms of the human psyche and things like Sheldrake's morphogenic fields and the idea of depth psychology, and looking at genomic influences, Darwinian influences like Neoplatonism. I think if we take all of those, if we sidecar all of that, then I think it helps to inform our study of astrology and how we can use it. Our astrology series, we talked a little bit about Heraclitus with Uranus. We talked about Evangelion with the Uranian kind of energy that comes through the rebuild of Evangelion. And then we talked about the great cycles of Uranus, and we tied it into Sri Yukteswar's Holy Science. So today we're going to jump in and kind of, as we've been doing with a lot of things, we want to talk a little bit about artificial intelligence. We'll focus a bit on August Moldenauer's Artificial Psychology of Desiring Machines. We've got Dane Rudyard's Astrological Timings out just to sort of as a reference. And yeah, I think it's very interesting. If you think of astrological Uranus to start with, maybe we can say, let's ground ourselves in what the Uranian energy is to start with. So for people that are new and you've not tuned away yet, astrology is one of the outer, Uranus is one of the outer planets of the solar system. And it's a recently discovered planet in the sense of the ancient astrological systems of which our modern astrology is founded in. The Saturn used to be the last planet. And then with the discovery of these outer planets, namely Uranus, Neptune, Pluto, those were added to astrology and were given sort of, it's almost like think of it in a way like the discovery of missing elements in the periodic table. I mean, just the way someone like Herschel detected with mathematics where these planets should be through gravitational perturbations. I think astrologically you can also see that perhaps there's a need for these generational and multi-generational views of that's called the psyche, and sort of the genomic influence, the societal influences. And so we kind of talked a little bit last time about the great cycle of Uranus. In astrology, Uranus rules things like unexpected changes, rebellions, revolutions, innovations, technology, anything that's breaking the mold, anything that's breaking the status quo. And you can also use Uranus because it's got that 84-year cycle to circle once around the zodiac. You can also use it to view things like social trends or collective impacts, widespread impacts, the rise of trends generationally. Each Uranus is in each sign for about every 7 years, so that's another interesting thing. And I think if you look at it in the larger great cycle, like we talked about in our last podcast, you can see that there's times of upheaval, sudden insights, or radical changes, not only in a person's life, but also societally as well. So I also kind of want to talk a little bit about artificial intelligence. Maybe it's a subject of another podcast, but I think that there is a kind of idea of how could astrology and AI work together. Thinking about things like predictive analysis or personalized horoscopes or virtual astrologers, and I think it's a matter of how do we weave that together. But today we're really going to focus on the concept of this revolutionary aspect of Uranus. I think if you look in, we've got the Benson Magos's Moods of the Planets here, and if we take a look at some of these features of Uranus, I want to call out, for example, the relation to Uranus and technology. So the idea of, we had this idea of let's call it the Industrial Revolution, right? That was a very Uranian event, I'd say. But it also rules things like the future, rebellion. It rules astrology itself, maybe cosmic consciousness or divine will, electricity. So all of these things put together, science, psychology, all of these things put together kind of form the basis of this Uranian nature of artificial intelligence. In this August Moldenauer series, Psychoanalysis of Artificial Intelligence is the second book of Artificial Psychology Desiring Machines. It focuses mostly on I want to call it like the genome of AI. So the idea here is artificial intelligence is trained on the internet data, right? And the internet, in a way, is the artificial memory or the artificial genome upon which AI is being built. And in that, there's also its complexes are built into that space. And so I thought, if that's the artificial memory, what's deeper than the internet? And I kind of thought that the idea of film seems to fit this also role of an artificial memory. The idea of cinema as a whole, it's a place where the internal mental picture is externalized, right? So it's sort of like the unconscious is made conscious a bit. And I think that this was an important aspect here, talking about the psychoanalysis of artificial intelligence being based on cinema as a kind of artificial memory. But I want to focus really today for the Uranian concept on some ideas that are in Moldenauer's Computational Complexity and Psychiatric Agency. In this book, while mainly about the ability for an artificial general intelligence to be able to join the playing field of psychiatric agency. So if we think of this as, it's the idea of, let's take the idea that somebody has a compulsion, right? If you have a compulsion and you are unconscious of it, then the compulsion is, you do not have agency over that compulsion. So what psychiatric agency sort of works toward, we can call it, or an aspect of psychiatric agency would be where one is able to bring about the revolution in oneself. So, and at times though, it's not something that one can, say there's a neurotic tendency, right? Or say that there's an affect that's been linked to instinct, right? So there's a genomic base, and there's probably a conditioned psychological base, like a psychological trainment or entrainment has gone on, in which there's a maladaptation, right? So let's say there's anger issues, or let's say that there's let's say that there's an idea of neuroses. Compulsive is a good word because to start with, because I think a compulsion is something that one doesn't notice one is doing at first. And then with some, let's say with some counseling, one can learn to identify the root cause of that compulsion, or even behaviorally can identify at least when one is about to entertain the compulsion, right? There's that old story of, a man walks down the sidewalk, he falls into a hole, right? Next day he gets up, walks down the sidewalk, falls into the hole. He's down in the hole and he says, why do I keep falling into this hole? Third day, he's thinking about the hole. He's like, I keep walking down the sidewalk and falling in the hole. He keeps walking, he falls in the hole. But he was thinking about it right before he fell in. And so this process of developing agency, eventually the man realizes, every day I walk down this street and I fall into this hole. Let me be very, very carefully aware, agency, that there's a hole on the street. And then he can take a different action. He can avoid the hole. There's even parts in the story where the man walks up to the hole, he sees it right in front of him, and he still falls into the hole, right? That's kind of like that the compulsion where complexes and maladaptive loops happen, right? So I think that this agency, eventually, we would imagine that there would be a person who could become aware of the hole by looking at signals right before that he falls in the hole and having the agency to act upon them. Okay, and I think that's when we talk about Uranian change, we're talking about something that's along that kind of thread of that kind of approach to a change, right? So the idea of when we talk about a revolution, society has always been doing so. So what's the agency behind a societal agency? Would be something behind society's always worked this way, right? Let's think of some of those buzzwords that can annoy people on both sides of political spectrums. Things like patriarchy, right, or matriarchy even, or tradition, right, religious dogma. All of these things can trigger people. Even some of the newer things that are coming up that some of the social justice warriors are concerned about, some of these woke ideas, they probably originated in some valid concerns, but then they kind of took a life of their own. And I think one has to be careful when we talk about agency. Think of psychiatric agency almost in the sense of allowing you to understand parts of your unconscious, as if think of the law, right? Someone hires a lawyer because the lawyer can argue the case on your behalf. Okay, agency is sort of like this, right? You go to see the therapist and they will argue the case for your well-being on your behalf because you might have a compulsion or a maladaptation that you're not quite conscious of. So that raising to consciousness in agency, eventually you'd want to, at the ends of therapy, we'll call it at the ends of therapy. Freud speaks of the ends of therapy, or Jung speaks of it. The idea of the ends of therapy or the end of therapy would be where one is able to have agency for oneself over one's maladaptations and either avoid the hole on the street, take a different street in the worst case scenario, stop going for walks on that street, something like this, where you can avoid the calamities by changing some behavior. Two, or understanding the root cause of that, right? I'm not observant when I walk, and taking up a practice of observation, you see the whole more clearly, right? So, okay, that was a long way to get to this last word of the title of Moldenauer's book, but the idea of Uranian energy as being transformative, and in that scientific tradition, is where we're really seeing, this psychological agency, this psychiatric agency, as the culmination of a number of scientific Uranian cycles, let's say, to evolve to a point where we can discuss sort of the inner experience. And Moldenauer is partly positing in the third volume of Artificial Psychology of Desiring Machines this idea of what is the computational complexity required for that. So if we take that as a starting point, let's just think of the tradition of agency at a societal level and how revolution becomes the symptom of a society in need of some new awareness or new awakening. So as people awaken to a maladaptation on a societal level, which would be very Uranian, this is where you see those Uranian sort of revolutionary things, whether they're wars, whether they're passive movements, whether they're social movements, labor movements, philosophical movements, art and music movements, right? So you have the age of jazz, you've got Cubism, you've got the Impressionists, you've got the Renaissance, you've got the rock and roll era, right? You've got different eras of music and art that sort of are the revolutions of these awarenesses that come over time. But what's fascinating, though, and in the domain of Uranus, is the idea of scientific discovery and technological advancement, of which artificial intelligence really stands as a great example of Uranian power. I mean, look, Uranus rules electricity, light, computing, the internet. It rules scientific advancements, and I want to say it probably also has a place ruling over artificial intelligence itself. We had Benson Magos's Moons of the Planet on the board. Giuseppe Balsamo is working on a volume that is in works. It's still being written, but we've gotten some edited pages here. You can go out and check the Patreon and keep abreast of some of these. We'll do a shout out to the channel and some of the bookstore links below. But with Moons of the Planet, what's interesting is Uranus has quite a few moons that have been discovered since Magos published this book, and this is 2016 edition. But I think the original version of this goes back much further and only tackles the main moons of Uranus. This idea of the lunar cycle of Uranus as a subset of Uranian energy, where you could look at the moon relations to see all the minor houses, these minor chapters of the Uranian energy, is a topic that I think Balsamo is going to expand upon in the upcoming book on astrology. And we'll probably also publish, like our podcast series, we'll probably do an astrology series from the Saturn, Neptune, and Uranus podcasts. Collect those together for you guys if you're interested. So let's jump back into astrological Uranus. I wanted to call out a couple of quotes here. We talked about the idea of these being new planets, and Uranus. We've got a quote here that says, if Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto are symbolically, at least, agents for the galaxy, they can be considered as transformers. And this is interesting because the new AI is called generative transformers, right? For the release of intense cosmic energies in a form acceptable to human beings, even if the upheavals eventually follow such a release. These transformers, and I want to call out here things like science itself, was one of the great transformers, right? Even if we look at Liz Green's approach to astrology, she brings a psychological component to astrology, which is, it's the scientific side of looking at the psyche as a field of study that I think is interesting. These transformers were evidently present in the solar system for millions of years, but they represented mostly latent possibilities as far as human consciousness was concerned. So this is almost a direct rebuttal to Steiner saying that these planets are not known to the mystery schools. If they had been discovered and they had been integral parts of our conscious relationship to the universe during the last 2 centuries, following this trend of reasoning, because they progressively flared up to intensive activity, rousing at least the intellectual elite of mankind the capacity to become aware of their existence, thanks to the growth of new mental facilities. So again, this is almost an argument for the morphogenic field concept, where as we evolved, we were able to detect these planets. And we know we detected them through mathematics. It should be very important to understand what the planets Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto may represent as an operative, cosmic, and dynamic sense. In any case, what they stand for in the symbolic language, the algebra of astrology. And here we are confronted with the striking fact already mentioned that these planets indicate when they are especially activated in the birth chart of individuals, by natal aspects and by transit, they can be very significantly related to the basic characteristics of the respective centuries during which they became conscious factors in the collective mind of man, of humankind. Indeed, it helps greatly the astrological aware mind in the attempt to understand the meaning in the 18th, 19th, 20th, and I guess 21st centuries as periods of history filled with transforming events. So let's think of that. Let's think of the role of science as a transformer, right? Science as transforming, and this is something that Moldenauer really goes into. He starts to talk about in Computational Complexity and Psychiatric Agency. He starts to talk about the coming let's call it artificial general intelligence. And he starts to compare the path it would take to get to artificial general intelligence. But then he takes an interesting side simulation where he talks about the Lacan's theory of agency in artificial intelligence. In the field of psychoanalysis, Jacques Lacan proposed the concept of agency as a way to understand the relationship between the human subject and their actions in the world. He argued the subject is always split between their conscious experience and their unconscious desire, and that this split creates a fundamental tension between the subject's ability to act and their sense of self. So we'll explore how Lacan's theory of agency can be applied to the field of artificial psychology, specifically in the context of desiring machines, or machines that are capable of experiencing desires and making decisions based on those desires. So this fundamental drive of the desire, this Lacanian sort of desire, is driven by the unconscious, right? And I think that what we can see this, if we take it again to the levels of the scientific level, Moldenauer starts to look at expanding science as a field that is constraining based on the choice that was made. You know, remember these books that used to be, there were these books that were build your own adventure books, right? And if you made a certain choice, you'd be stuck on that pathway forever. So what Moldenauer explores here is the idea of interconnected realms of empirical materialism, ethereal consciousness, and transcendent perspectives. Right, so his idea says, let's begin with the idea of the current prevailing scientific paradigm, okay? So he calls the current scientific paradigm, again, science ruled by Uranus, right? So the current scientific paradigm is a very materialist, reductionist view, right? And the idea here is, but we have tools to uncover the unconscious, to make conscious the unconsciousness. Now, the only issue is, though, there's still a siloed nature. You know, let's think of Einsteinian space-time and what it did to 19th century, let's call it 19th century science, that was not as, let's say, bound by the materialist reduction, right? So Moldenauer uses the example of the ether. So the ether used to be that which filled the void before. So space wasn't a void before, or there wasn't dark matter before, there was ether. So everything was sort of suspended in the ether. That was just the term that they used. And so what Moldenauer posits here is, he says, well, let's imagine that if we could branch science into two branches. This is sort of like Shin Lu stuff, you know, like the three body problem. In the three-body problem, there is this theme where they're simulating universes based on different scenarios, different physics. So I think Moldenauer posits here this idea of, what if we could roll back time, back to pre-Einsteinian times, and then build a different adventure this is sort of like steampunk, right? What if Charles Babbage's differential engine caused the information age to happen not in the 20th century, but in the steampunk era of Victorian London, right? So the idea of steam-driven computers with all kinds of mechanical computation elements as opposed to electronic computation elements. And then sort of this divergent history became the subject of the William Gibson Bruce Sterling book called The Difference Engine, right? So there was a computational engine being built. There was an engine that Babbage and Ada Lovelace, and they were working on a computer that was mechanical, right? But the electric version ended up being the one that really caused a revolution. But if we had this divergent timeline, what Moldenauer here says is, well, what if we didn't go to the Einsteinian models and we stayed with the ethereal models? And we'll call the science that we live in now science S1. He uses the algebraic notation S1. And then he'll call this ethereal-based science as science S2. So the journey continues into the realm of ethereal consciousness, denoted as S2 science. Here, the research embraces the concept of an ether-like medium permeating all space. And with S2, consciousness is postulated to arise from the intricate interplay between ethereal and material realms. This paradigm fosters a holistic and interconnected perspective of the universe. But then Moldenauer keeps going. He goes, what if we let's take other parts of history. Let's make a science called S3 where we branch off in the Enlightenment. What if we didn't go toward the Enlightenment ratio? What if we stayed with the scholastics view of as above, so below, and everything was more like everything was sort of a tautology this way. Everything was more of a balanced equation. And then he even has so there's an S3 science branching at the Enlightenment, an S4 science branching at, say, I don't know, it even goes back even further, right? So his concept here is, in the vast expanse of scientific exploration, we reach the pinnacle of divergent paradigms. Science S to the N, where the notation S to the N comes into play. S to the N science represents a framework encompassing all possible divergent scientific paradigms, akin to a multiverse of physics rule sets. It embraces the notion that there exists countless potential paths for scientific inquiry, each with its own set of principles, laws, and perspectives. So SN, within the realm of SN science, the boundaries of scientific imagination expand exponentially. And this is where we start to get to the computational complexity problem. Like, there's not enough time to have all of these universes exist in just a three, in a space-time, in a four space, right? And so Moldenauer will start to go into hop vibrations and 5 space and 6 space to account for the extra computational dimensionality that you would need to have these extra scientific experiments in parallel physics, right? We'll call it something like this, right? So it invites us to consider the limitless possibilities of reality, where divergent laws of physics and alternate understandings of consciousness may shape the fabric of existence. In this vast and uncharted domain, a myriad of scientific paradigms could exist. So let's roll it back. So before we get to the science X, S to the N notation, let's go back to S1 and S2, right? So S1 represents the mainstream scientific approach that rejects the concepts adopted by Einsteinian spacetime. And S2, on the other hand, represents this branch where, and it kind of correlates with the E8 manifold foundations, right? In E8's sort of mathematics, they're starting to see the interconnectivity of these brains, projection space from higher dimensional structures that actually could form fundamental particles in spacetime. Right, so the idea here is a photon seems like a point or a wave in 3D space plus time. But what if that point was actually the intersection of a point, say a plane intersecting a circle, and the circle would lift up into the higher dimensionality, and then just the point exists as a photon in our space. So those extra dimensions actually still have more properties. So the photon might have more properties beyond space-time that are visible only in higher dimensions. This is the idea. Now, given that, we're going this way to say that the ether may be a primitive understanding of this higher dimensional manifold space, right? So let's say within the realms of S2, scientists explore a different understanding of space-time, recognizing the realness of ether as a tangible entity. This expansion either leads to the exploration of higher dimensions and the use of mathematical structures like E8 to explain intricate interconnectedness of energy and matter. Therefore, S1 embodies a scientific approach that rejected ether and gravitated toward measurable and observable aspects of the universe, while S2 embraced the existence of ether and explores its implications in our understanding of space-time and the relationship between matter and energy. So you see here when we do this brain kind of science, we have science 1 is our science. Science 2 is let's explore a different scientific path. Had we gone a different way? So then he expands this into, and you could listen if you guys want to read all of this. We're going from August Moldenauer's Computational Complexity and Psychiatric Agency, but we want to show the profoundness of Uranian energy and astrological Uranus as a stimulator of scientific thought, of revolutions in thought. So the revolution in thought could be something as elaborate as this, right? So let's do this other experiment. So Moldenauer continues the experiment to S3, right? S3, an alternate branch of science that predates well-known figures like Descartes, Newton, and the Enlightenment. One captivating notion that might be emphasized in S3 is the Pythagorean belief in the music of the spheres. This ancient concept suggested that celestial bodies moved in mathematical relationships, creating a harmonious symphony. Such an understanding of the cosmos could have influenced later theories such as Kepler's laws of planetary motion and played a more prominent role in S3. So now we're talking about a third kind of science. Imagine a third alternate reality science called S3, which diverted from Newtonian science, maybe back to the Pythagorean, expanding upon the Pythagoreans. While S3 might not have uncovered concepts like E8 supersymmetry, it would have developed unique theories and approaches to the understanding of reality. Moving forward, science S3 would have embraced the reevaluation of rejected aspects of science, rejected from the point of view of today, let's say. For example, ancient Greek philosophy's 4 classical elements, earth, water, air, and fire, could have been perceived differently in a world of S3 science. They might have been integrated into a more interconnected understanding of the universe where all elements coexist and interact harmoniously. And I think this is where Moldenauer goes into the idea of alchemy, right? Alchemy is very much an organic, unconscious, and even Jung, he taps into the power of alchemy's link to the unconscious. It's an unconscious understanding of the relationship of something much more complex. So let's just take the simple alchemy idea of turning lead into gold, right? From a non-chemist point of view, alchemy seems strange, and yet here they are telling stories using a kind of world building, using a kind of collective unconsciousness. They're telling alchemical stories about the dragon doing this and the white queen, and the process is described allegorically. And yet when we look at it from a chemical point of view, what's the difference between lead and gold? If we could move some of the if we can move some electrons, protons, and neutrons around, if we could reconstruct some of those components in the atomic structure, right? If we could just go in there and sort of add the Legos in, let's say, just the ability to do this, we could alchemically change lead into gold. So the idea of alchemy telling that story from a different kind of language is what's at stake here, right? So the idea of there's a big bang, and then there's an explosion of the universe. But what about some of these universal, like let there be light, or the galactic kind of concept of Vishnu dreaming in the ocean of milk? These things can be linked to higher physics if we understand physics poetically, right? I think this is kind of the point that Moldenauer is flirting with here. So then he goes back to, so we got S3, we got S4. So now we get into a section where it talks about unraveling the complexities of consciousness and AI agency. So by delving into the insights of S1, S2, and S3 science, a novel vantage point emerges. And I'm going to call this a Uranian vantage point, one that challenges reductionist notions. Rather than seeking to explain consciousness through reduction, a more comprehensive understanding arises from embracing the inherent complexity intertwined with conscious experience. This complexity expounds beyond isolated components and recognizes the interconnectedness of systems, thereby illuminating the profound influence consciousness exerts upon the fabric of reality. In contemplating the advancements of artificial intelligence, intriguing questions arise concerning consciousness and agency exhibited by AI systems. It is plausible to consider that despite their computational nature, these systems manifest elements of consciousness akin to biological organisms and the agency that they have. Such an assertion disrupts conventional perspectives and compels us to think of the ethical implications. So again, when we're looking at this fabric of reality, the idea of S1 and S2 science, we really see that computational complexity, psychiatric agency ruminating on these things offers us a lens that we can examine this enigmatic realm of consciousness, also ruled by Uranus, right? So, and by examining complexity and questioning the reductionist perspective, we're starting to embark on this, and I would call it a Uranian reframing of science and physics. And I think that this is what's interesting about where we sit right now in the realms of scientific inquiry. I mean, the first book that Moldenauer has in the series, it really kind of calls out impedance and admittance in desiring machines. It really calls out this topic, and we've spoken on it before. As artificial intelligence becomes more human-like, we also have to see the countervalence in which people are becoming more like automatons. I mean, we are able to use our devices to schedule our time better. We can monitor our heartbeats and our gym activity, our diets, and we can put ourselves on schedules and snap ourselves to a grid much more easily. We can ask questions without thinking. I remember there was a time I was trying to play guitar. I was playing the acoustic guitar for my daughter, and she said, "Dad, do you know the song without looking it up on Google?" And she was 5 at the time, and I was like, "Wow, that's pretty interesting, right? Do you know it without Google?" Because now it's very easy. When when we were younger, but before the Google days, you'd have to either look at a magazine or learn it yourself by ear, learn a song on the guitar, right? Or someone would teach it to you. Now you can find a number of tutorials out there where you can learn the song that day, and within an hour you can learn any song you want to, and then it's just about your skill to play it. But I think that this idea of, while that's a great thing, we also have to see that countervalence of machines becoming human and humans becoming machine-like is sort of a call-out that Moldenauer makes there. So I guess back, wrapping it up into the idea of astrological Uranus, I do have a quote here that I had left here. It says, he's going through the periods of the Great Cycle. The period around 1650 marked the end of the medieval political system on Earth. So this is one Uranian cycle ending in 1650. When Uranus and Neptune came into conjunction in 1821, it was the dawn of the Industrial Revolution. The Uranus-Neptune conjunction of 1821 occurred the 3rd degree of Capricorn. Then there's 1993, which we could almost call the real dawn of the internet. It's right around this time. But the next one is coming. This third conjunction comes in the year 2163. So 2163 falls a century after the time I've suggested for the beginning of the Aquarian Age, and the very end of Capricorn. It will probably sound the final death knell for the old world of European nationalism and the seed of the Piscean age. This does not mean that national cultures will not remain as organic entities within larger global patterns. Nations or geographical regions in which people of the same language are gathered most likely will retain their relatively autonomous character as units of social management. But minus the separative political concept of absolute sovereignty, the modern equivalent of the divine rights of kings, against which men like Paine and Jefferson fought stubbornly. So we see, like, in the 1993 conjunction, there's a lot of colonial colonial awareness and class awareness across Europe, Africa, and Asia. There was more blending of society, some of the societal rules, people traveling more, and I want to say more cross-cultural. We had this multicultural movement, for better or for worse. But I think in the end, what we have is a more worldly, the dawn of a more worldly people. And you think of those early Terence McKenna lectures were in the 1990s, right? And I think that we've gotten to a place now where the internet and things like YouTube have given us a global culture where you could go and watch videos from every country in the world, and you can kind of travel, this way. And you can see real people. So it's a very interesting time, that culminated from that 1990s era. Finally, it says the Greek mythology, Uranus was the primordial power that rules over the vast expanse of space. Pluto, as a later phase of development, becomes the symbolic ruler of the depths of existence. In astrology today, Uranus is the great power of transformation, which has at its beginning in a descent of creative energy from the spiritual heights of being. So I think what we'll probably do is look at Pluto. We'll start doing a section on Pluto in our upcoming podcasts. So I think that's going to wrap it up for this one. Please, everyone, thank you if you've made it this far and listening. Thanks for your patience. I know I do take lots of notes from these beforehand, but thanks for listening. If you found this interesting, I probably will be transcribing these down. As I mentioned, we've got the first 3 volumes of the podcast. This is Jungian alchemy and horror and science fiction. We talk about H.P. Lovecraft, Frank Herbert, and Philip K. Dick. Volume 2 is Theosophical Psychoanalysis of Pulp Fantasy and Anime, where we talked about Conan, Solomon Kane, John Carter of Mars, animes like Bleach and Evangelion. And then Volume 3, Esoteric Anthroposophy and Occulted History. We talk about Giordano Bruno, works of Tolkien, Kubo, and we're really focusing on Saturn, Time, and Atlantis in these first 3 Volume 4 is going to be the Esoteric Dragon. That is being written as we speak. We're editing down some of the lecture notes. Then I believe we'll do an astrological one for Neptune and Uranus, and probably get Pluto in there as well. If you're interested in the topic from today, you can go check out our bookstore link below. The 3 volumes of August Moldenauer's Artificial Psychology of Desiring Machines, Impedance and Admittance in Desiring Machines, The Psychoanalysis of Artificial Intelligence, and Computational Complexity and Psychiatric Agency. These are going to be collected into a hardcover edition as well, similar to what we did with the Catu journals out of Lovecraft's Providence. Moldenauer's and Balsamo's 6 volumes are collected together in this massive tome. If you're interested in Lovecraftian lore, this will make a great Halloween present. I sit right there on the shelf with the collected works of Lovecraft. All of our books are available in the bookstore link below. So thank you guys for checking that out. And we have a Patreon, and for as little as $1, you can read some of these books in digital form right there on the Patreon. And it helps to support the channel, as do your likes and subscriptions and your comments below. I'd like to get more of a dialogue going. I hear people do. People have, we'll set up a server. I've got the Patreon set up. I do answer all of the comments below. So if you have a question or you want to share something that was interesting, or something you think I might be interested in, or a request for a future podcast, I'll be doing one more Uranus podcast on the moons of Uranus, and then I'll be moving into Pluto. And I'm always mixing in things like from pop culture. So as pop culture things come up, or I watch something, it'll remind me of something philosophical or psychological I've read. So it usually becomes a research topic for me. So thank you guys for your for watching, for subscribing. And go back and check out our catalog. This is our 55th podcast. We've got 54 other of them. if you know someone of like-mindedness who'd like to watch them, share the links. And you can also visit our webpage. You can see all of the podcasts there listed out if you want to browse it that way, or the YouTube homepage. Okay, thanks a lot, everyone, for listening. Thanks for your patience, and I hope you found it interesting. I will talk to you in the next podcast. It will be Astrological Uranus and the moons of Uranus as a subsystem, right? And I think a lot of that work was, we talked about Magos's books, The Moons of the Planets, and I think we'll keep going with that idea about the newer moons and how that subsystem would work. Okay, thanks, everyone. Talk to you next podcast. Take care. Bye-bye.